I'm Dr. Tumelty Felice. I wanted to talk a little bit more about ACEs and why our adverse childhood experiences and knowledge about those experiences can be beneficial in our personal and professional practice. Maya Angelou said, when you know better, you do better. So we can learn about our ACEs and our own history, whether we've experienced trauma or whether we've experienced it vicariously in our job, through other people, through the people we love, but what our foundations have to do with our long-term healing and development. It can be a passageway to healing. It can be an opportunity to grow through what you go through, or to illuminate better understanding of the people around us and how we relate to them in a more empathetic way. So if we look a little bit about what ACEs are and the research, we can talk about, through some of the resources that have been provided in the course, you hear the word trauma a lot and what that means. And it can not just be something with a negative connotation in terms of what's happened to us, but as a tool, a protective response, something that when we perceive something dangerous, we have this response to. That can also be when we experience things, we go back to that response, whether that was something that happened to us in our childhood, or that we were bullied, or that we went through a difficult experience, that we return to that same, what we could call a trauma response or pattern of responding. That can be both effective and adaptive and can help us recognize when something feels threatening or tap into those feelings and how we overcame some of those challenges, but it can also be maladaptive and pull us into a place that is not most effective for our overall well-being. Recognizing that is key. So how does that relate to growing from that, building upon that, and being able to bounce back from adversity? It doesn't define us necessarily, our ACEs, but it helps to inform us and illuminate ways to respond differently or to do better. So some of the ways we can do that have to do with building resiliency, bouncing back from our adversity, understanding that foundational thing that we've gone through, that experience that we've had or shared or lived through, and what that can do to help us be better equipped to deal with adversity in the future. A little bit about ACEs. The original study that has been shared, and there's a ton of research on, was done by Kaiser Permanente, and they looked at about 17,500 people and gave them a survey that you can take through the link provided, looking at what their background experiences were and what adverse childhood experiences they had faced. These centered around household challenges, abuse, and neglect. And the interesting part in looking at this is not only did we look at what these adverse experiences were and frame them in that way, but also the longitudinal effects of being exposed to or living through or experiencing ACEs. When someone had a higher ACE score, they tended to have a greater likelihood of negative outcomes, health outcomes long-term. And it would be easy to say that if we have trauma or challenges or adversity in our childhood, then we might engage in behaviors that later led to poor health outcomes. But that's not the case. That could be the case, that could be a coping mechanism, but also even with any other experiences or exposure, people who had ACEs tended to have poor health outcomes due to a different transcription of DNA, due to neuroplasticity, due to a lot of different variables that have been studied since this initial study came out. What does that do for us? What does that tell us? It's not a necessarily negative thing that if I had this high ACE score, this defines how my life will go. But it does illuminate, just as much as knowing anything in our genetic backgrounds, where we may have areas that we can build our resilience, that we can know more about, that we can overcome those challenges and use those challenges to propel us to better health, greater awareness, and an opening or opportunity for better self-understanding and understanding of others. When we use that information effectively, it can really be a great tool for learning. What can be challenging, and one of the things we talk about as a challenge to ACEs, are when we get locked into a pattern of responsiveness to those challenges, to trauma, that can cause us to be easily triggered. So if we first start with that fight, flight, or freeze response, if we get locked into a negative or maladaptive trauma response or challenge response to when adversity happens, our heart rate increases, we get tense, we get upset, we get locked into the parasympathetic nervous system. This nervous system is the one that is super effective if we're in a situation that requires fight, flight, or freeze. If we're, being chased by something, or if we're, in a time where we need that adrenaline dump, we need to be very much focused and use that that sympathetic nervous system. Increased heart rate, increased breathing rate. Everything else is kind of shut off, and we are hyper-focused, which is great if we're in that situation. The hard part is when we get locked into that response in the sympathetic nervous system. What helps us is to be able to recognize that, because long-term effects of being stuck in the sympathetic nervous system aren't great for us, throws off that homeostasis or balance that we need to be healthy and effective. And we can find a way to use our vagus nerve, which controls this, to put us into the parasympathetic nervous system. Some people call that the rest and digest, the one that allows us to relax, to breathe, to slow down our heart rate, to breathe again, to function optimally and with homeostasis. The tricky part is, how do we recognize when we're locked in our sympathetic nervous system, locked in that response that might not suit the situation, right? It's great if we're in a threat situation, but if we're in a situation that we perceive based on habit and pattern as a threat that might not really threaten us, we need to be able to hijack that vagus nerve and get to the parasympathetic nervous system so that we can use our prefrontal cortex. We can get out of survival brain and get into logic, rational thinking, decision-making brain, and we can make sure we're not reacting to a situation, we're responding to a situation. Long-term, this is better for us. When we know about our ACEs, when we know about trauma, when we know about our triggers, it helps us better recognize when we're responding that way and to be more effective, more mindful, and overall, long-term, more healthy.